Welcome to Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean. Today we are on location in Petaluma, California at my buddy Aaron's place. And what we're going to show you how to do today is install a heavy-duty aftermarket battery cable set on a FZJ80 Land Cruiser. There's a guy on the Toyota forum called IHateMud.com. His name is Mark. His screen name is Forerunner, and he makes these really awesome heavy-duty battery cable sets for different vehicles. He also does custom stuff for other projects, like an upgrade for an alternator cable or a dual battery setup or some type of exploration vehicle where you're putting additional batteries maybe in the rear of your vehicle. And he not only works on Toyota and Lexus vehicles, but he works on every vehicle. So if you have a custom project, you could contact him. The ways you could contact him are through the IHateMud.com forum, or you can contact him via email, which I will provide both of those in the video description. Before we get started with the job, let's show you what comes with the kit. So here's everything that comes with the kit. You get a nice set of instructions that labels what each cable is, and then on the back side is the list of instructions of how to install the cables, which we will be following for this video. First, you have the two battery terminal connectors for the negative and positive post. You have this long red cable, which goes from the battery to the starter. You have this long black cable, which goes from the battery to the engine block. And then you have three shorter ground wires. One of them goes from the battery to the inner side of the driver's side fender. You have another ground cable that goes from the head to the firewall. And then finally, you have another ground cable that goes from the transfer case to the body. And then this cover right here is a cover for the connection to the starter. So this just mimics how the OEM starter wire gets protected. The first thing you need to do is you need to open your hood. Next, we're going to disconnect both the negative and positive terminals from the battery. We got a frickin' crow in the background ruining the video. Shut up, crow. The battery terminals, if they're OEM, are a 10mm nut. I'm just going to loosen those with my 1/4" ratchet and a deep 10mm socket. Okay, the negative is disconnected. And the positive. The instructions don't say to do this, but while I'm working on the cables, I want to get the battery completely out of my way. I'm going to disconnect the bracket here. It is also held in place with two 10mm nuts. I'm going to use my little DeWalt gun to loosen the bracket nuts. There's that crow. Once you have the brackets loose enough, you can fish the J-hooks out of their areas that they go into. So on the fender, it goes in right there. And then on this side, it hooks into this plastic box that surrounds the battery. And so this is what it looks like. Okay, I'm just gonna lift this sucker out. The next step is we disconnect the positive cable to the top of the starter. From experience, because Aaron and I replaced the starter on his 80 series Land Cruiser, what we're gonna do is we're gonna jack up the front end, we're gonna settle the truck on jack stands, we're gonna remove the driver front tire so we can access through the fender area to get to that starter. That's the best access that we have seen. You potentially could be leaning over the top of the truck, but that's much harder. The access is way easier from inside the fender well. All right, we have the front end jacked up. We have the front axle supported with a 6-ton jack stand. Now I'm gonna remove the tire. I'm gonna get this decorative cover out of the way. You can just grab a pry bar or a screwdriver. There's a slot you can get into and just pop this sucker out. The lug nuts are a 21mm. I'm gonna zip them out with my 1/2" DeWalt gun. Here's the starter, and you'll notice it looks brand new because we recently shot a video replacing it. The cable that we have to disconnect is right at the top, It has a protective gray cover, and the back end of it you can flip up to expose the 12mm nut. You can see the silver nut right on the top there, and I'm gonna break that free with a 1/4" ratchet and 12mm socket. The nut is loose. I can get it off the rest of the way with my hand, and I'll just slip that off, and you can see now that the cable is loose. That positive cable that goes to the top of the starter is joined to the negative cable that goes to the engine block. The negative cable attaches to the engine block with a 14mm bolt right behind the engine oil filter. Because they're joined, I'm going to remove the positive cable and negative cable as a unit. So next, I'm going to get onto that 14mm bolt with a socket and ratchet and break it free. I tried to break free that 14mm bolt with a 3/8 ratchet, but I didn't have enough mechanical advantage to break it free. It was on there super tight. So I switched to a longer 1/2" drive ratchet. I have a short wobble extension, and if you don't know what a wobble extension is, it allows for a little bit of articulation with the socket. It has a different style end to it that allows the socket to wobble a little bit. So if you can't get a straight shot onto the bolt or nut you're trying to get loose, that little bit of articulation will help you. And then I'll show you the access of where I'm getting my ratchet. So here's my access. You can see this track bar here, and here's the front axle. So I'm going in between those two with my 1/2" ratchet to get up there to break that free. You could try it from the top too, but I chose not to be leaning over the engine compartment to get this one broken free. So that 14mm bolt is a little shorty that attaches the negative battery cable to the block. So this is the positive and negative cable assembly. It's got a plastic clip that attaches it to some other ground wires that go to the inside of the driver fender. So I'm going to disconnect that now. It's just like a little ratcheting setup. You just lift up on them and you can break it free. This is what it looks like. The cables are attached to a bracket here, and I could disconnect it. There's a plastic tab here. I could pull it outward and then slide it off the post. Just like that. This is what I was pulling on. Pull it outward so you can slide it off that post. There's a zip tie that attaches that cable assembly to some other cables, and I'm going to cut that with a small pair of dikes. Aaron's got some accessory connections here. I think they're for his alarm system. I'm just going to remove the nut on the terminal and get those free. And then I'm just going to put that nut back on. Next, I'm going to disconnect this 10mm bolt that attaches the negative terminal to the inside of the driver fender. I'm just going to reattach that bolt to the fender so I don't lose it. These grommets will come out. You could just remove them. And then I'm going to pull the cables through the battery box here. And then we should be able to fish this whole thing out. What else is connected here? Oh, strike that. We have to disconnect these cables first from the positive terminal, and that looks like it's a 12mm. So we have to remember to reattach these to the positive terminal, and then see if I can fish this out. It's gonna take a second look at how it's routed right now. It goes behind the engine oil dipstick, so that's something to note. It goes on the inside of these cables right here. That's another thing to note. So just try to mimic the original routing so we get an optimal routing for the new cables. So I'm gonna slide these up. And here's the whole assembly. So you have your negative terminal, you have the positive wire that goes from the battery all the way to the starter connection, and then this was the ground wire that attached to the block right behind the engine oil filter. The next step is we grab the positive terminal and we're going to connect up the starter wire to it. So I just loosen the nut. Based off how the terminal end is formed, you could go on like this or you can go on like that. And because we have to connect up the fusible link connectors to this, I'm thinking it might be better to put it on like so and then try that. It might not work out, but for now I'm going to put it on like this. So this way the bend of the terminal end isn't going to get in the way of the other wires coming in nice and flat up against the big positive cable. Next, I'm going to slide over the red protective boot over the end of the cable that's going to be connecting to the starter. I think we're going to put a little bit of dielectric grease on here to make it to where it slides on the cable easier. I have a little bit of the grease on the inside of the boot. Let's see if that makes it easier. Okay, that actually helped. Next, I'm going to slide the positive cable through the battery box. And then I'm going to mimic the routing that we noted and route it back towards the starter. So it goes underneath the throttle cable here, and then it goes behind the engine oil dipstick. Okay, that's looking like it did before, and I'm gonna get into the wheel well and attach the terminal to the starter. I've got the cable attached to the top of the starter with the nut, and then I slid the protective boot over. So that's what it should look like. Originally, we had the terminal end flipped, but after attaching the cable to the starter, having the terminal end in this orientation puts less of a bind on the cable. The cable has a certain memory to it, and it wants to be in this orientation. So we're going to try that and be able to connect up the other connectors with it in this orientation. These two connections that we have to connect to the positive terminal aren't big enough to slide over this lug. So we have to drill them out. And the size you need to drill them to is 3/8. We're gonna take this tape off and disconnect these two terminals so we can drill them out separately. So the way I'm gonna drill these out is I'm gonna hold on to the terminal with a pair of channel locks and drill with my right. I'm going to start off with an 11/32 drill bit and then step it up until I get to 3/8. Okay, that one's drilled out to 11/32. Now I'm going to do the second one. We finished the drilling of the terminals. It is a little bit of a pain in the butt. It definitely helps to have an extra set of hands. One person holding the terminal end with a pair of channel locks or pliers while the other person drills. And just be careful, go slow with the drill, because at some point the drill is going to really grab onto the terminal and want to twist it out of your hands, and then you could really tweak the wire like we did a few times. So just drill really, really nice and slow and just graduate up to the 3/8 size drill bit and you'll be good to go. We've got the fusible link connectors connected up to the positive terminal. We did decide to change the orientation of this cable that goes to the starter because in the other orientation they weren't going to join up very well. So the cable does have a little bit of tension on it now because we had to twist it, but it's going to work out just fine. Next we have the negative terminal. We have the big negative cable that goes to the engine block, and then we have one of the shorter ground cables that goes from the negative terminal to the inside of the fender. I'm first going to connect up the ground cable that goes to the engine block to the terminal. I'm going to keep it in this orientation with the bend facing inboard, so when I put the other cable on, it's going to lay flatter. So if you look at that, the terminal ends are going to be opposite each other with the bends going away from each other. Just like that. I'm going to feed this end through the battery box. The 90-degree bend terminal connects up to the engine block. I'm going to put the boot in there. And the negative cable for the engine block is going to follow the same path that the positive wire that runs to the starter, because we're going to join those together just like they were joined with the OEM setup. I'm going to connect up the smaller ground wire to the fender with the 10mm bolt. I'm going to tighten up the cable so the cable is pushed right up against the back of the box in order for it to not be in the way of the battery. And we'll see how that works out when we get the battery in. These two ring connectors are too small to fit over this battery bolt. So we're gonna have to drill these out a little bit bigger, and we're gonna attach them right here like they were before on the OEM setup. We could also just ground those wires to the fender. I got underneath the truck and I made the connection of the ground wire to the block with the 14mm bolt. And I used the same access from underneath, but this time I used the 3/8 ratchet because that thing was just way too tight before. So I snugged it up good, and we'll go on to the next step. Now we're underneath the truck and we're gonna replace the ground cable that goes from the body to the transfer case. This is the cable right here. This is the attachment to the body, and then it attaches to the transfer case here. This is a 12mm bolt, and then the one to the body is a 10mm. I'm gonna loosen the body connection first. And now I'll disconnect the cable connection to the transfer case. That connection looks a little bit dirty, so I'm gonna grab some brake cleaner and a rag and clean that connection up to the transfer case. All right, the transfer case to body ground is installed. The last ground cable we're gonna swap out is the head to the firewall. It's this one right here. I'm gonna use my Milwaukee ratchet to zip them out. And then it attaches to the head right there. And there's this tiny little wire. I've got the cable installed with the two 12mm bolts, and then I'm just cinching them up with my 3/8 ratchet. Okay, they're both nice and tight. That head to the firewall cable was the last cable. We've got the battery back in, and now we're tightening up the terminals to the battery. These marine grade battery terminals have two sizes for the nuts. The bigger one is a 14mm and the smaller one is a 13mm. We've got the battery terminals tight to the battery. Now we want to start it and just make sure everything's working as it should. After that, then we're gonna work on tidying up the main negative terminal to the block ground and the positive cable to the starter. We're gonna zip tie those together and get it routed really nicely. All right, we're good. So here's the routing. We used that OEM clip to attach it right here. And then we join the negative and positive cables together with a zip tie there. And then finally, we put another zip tie that attaches the positive cable to the engine oil dipstick. And that seems to be keeping it away from anything hot that will melt the wire, and we're pretty happy with that. So now all we have to do is get the tire back on, lower the truck to the ground, and torque the lug nuts to 85 foot-pounds. All right, Aaron and I are done with the heavy-duty cable install on his FZJ80 Land Cruiser. As you saw, it's not very complicated at all. The hardest cable connection to get to is that block ground right near the engine oil filter. But with that said, it still wasn't that hard. So this is a pretty straightforward upgrade for your 80 series Land Cruiser, and we highly recommend using Mark for your cable needs. You could do it yourself, get the cable and get a hydraulic crimper and the terminal ends, and you could do this yourself, but it's kind of hard to beat that Mark already has all the links and cables, and it just makes it that much easier. So for the money, I believe Mark has a very good product, and you will be very happy with his cables that he provides you. With all that said, we thank you for watching Toy at a Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean and special guest Aaron. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. If you haven't subscribed yet, I don't know what the hell you're waiting for. Click on that subscribe button and also click on that notification bell if you'd like to be notified when we put up new content on our channel, which we are always putting up very helpful and sick mods kind of content, so don't miss out. Peace out. Bye-bye.